Hey everybody, welcome back. We've got a pre-recorded lecture here for week 9 of our Taiji and Qigong class. Today our goal is to discuss our model of consciousness in traditional Chinese worldview, and we're going to talk a little bit about the 5 spirits or the 5 intelligences, and then we're going to home in on one particular intelligence that we use in a very specific manner during our Qigong or Neigong practice, and we will also use in a very specific manner when we use sharp things like needles to help our patients. So there's a saying that's going to be on the handout that talks about unity of mind with undistracted focus. And before we can answer what that might look like, we need to look into a little bit of what is the theory of mind? What is this theory of consciousness in the traditional East Asian model? And we talk about the 5 spirits in regard to this. So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to start going through this a little bit. So when we talk about the 5 spirits or 5 intelligences in Chinese medicine, some of you may be familiar from your foundations class about the names of these, and we'll get into that for a second. But before we do, we need to backtrack a little bit and talk about what does it mean to be in this traditional East Asian cosmology. The first thing to re-acknowledge is that we are composite compound beings. We're not one thing, but rather a bunch of different things coming together. In our traditional East Asian medicine, there was not a lot of time taken to talk about the soul per se, as in a soul that could be saved, a soul that could be reincarnated over various lifetimes, although Buddhism did have something to say about that when it was imported into China. Traditionally, though, the view was that we as beings are a set of relationships, right? A set of relationships. Our experience is a focus in a field of relationships, a node in a network of qi transformation. And we've already talked about a bunch of these different ideas of qi transformation, right? That we have qi transformation related to space in the directions, qi transformation related to time in the cycles of the day and the cycles of the season. We've also talked about this relationship of the microcosm of our body, our experience as having a body as being reflective of the macrocosm of the universe. So these phases or elements that we might talk about in the external world are mirrored in our own internal experience. So just as we observe 5 phases of change in the natural world, we observe that our bodies have these 5 phases incorporated in our experience, specifically around the organs. And we talked about the 5-phase model and how each of these different organs relates to one of these phases. In fact, it can't really be thought of as distinct from these phases, but is rather our direct experience of these phases is these organs, right? So this is very, very, very important to remember, that we're not this free-floating soul that has no qualities, that may pop into incarnation and then pop out of incarnation in sort of a Platonic model of an evolution of the soul, or a South Asian model of sort of a karmic reincarnation of the soul, but rather there's a set of circumstances that arise. There's these relationships between the 5 phases, the yin and yang, and we are that experience of these relationships. So big picture stuff. We'll get a little bit more specific here and we'll name some of these things. So just to review, if you haven't heard about this in your foundations class, you will. And I think I have a little bit of a different take than you find in most foundations texts. So I wanted to make sure folks at least heard this, a little bit more informed by pre-communist Taoist philosophy rather than post-communist materialist philosophy. One of the things the communists did when they came to power was they took out all references to the spirit in the medicine, because a materialist philosophy doesn't acknowledge the spirit, right? And they downplayed and tried to sort of reduce the descriptions of these different spirits to biology, like mechanistic biology. So let's review these in sort of the way that you may encounter them in Giovanni Macioja's book, and then we'll kind of go into each of them individually. So the spirit of the spleen or the earth is called the I, and this is often thought of as the intellect. We'll get into that. That of the lung or the metal phase is called the pol. That of the kidney or the water phase is called the jert, Z-H-I. That of the liver or wood phase, which we spoke about just briefly last week, is the hun. And then lastly, of the heart organ is thought of, the fire phase is described as a shun. So there's these 5 different spirits or intelligences, sometimes erroneously called souls. Souls is such a laden term in sort of European culture that I want to avoid using that. I don't want to talk about the souls. I'd rather talk about spirits or intelligences, because I think that more accurately reflects where these are sort of coming from, rather than some sort of immortal soul that, you know, stands up at Judgment Day or something like that. It has very, very, very little to do with that sort of cosmology, right? So we have these 5 different intelligences that are operative in our experience. And because we are teaching Yangsheng practices, I do want us to look into particularly how we experience these actively and realistically, right? So we'll talk first about the E. So the E, which belongs to the spleen, is often thought of as an intention or focus or intellect. There's a certain relationship to rational activity, to analysis with it. It also has this quality of when we focus our mind in the short term, like if I'm going to be paying attention in class, I'm using my E. I'm using my E to focus in on the material that's coming in, to absorb it, digest it, assimilate it, right? So it is like the intellect. It's also just raw intention. So if you want to stare at a dot on the wall, if you're doing a meditation practice, looking at a candle or counting your breaths, you are using your E. You are strengthening your E, the short-term willpower, right? I'm going to do this. I'm not going to be distracted. That's sort of an E orientation. In our bodies, it also helps us absorb nutrient. So not just information, but also nutrient. It works on both of these and has a strong relationship with the liver when we talk about digestion and appetite, which we got into last week a little bit. Pathologically, we can think that pensiveness or overcogitation actually drains the E, right? Or can be a disorder of the E. So sometimes when our head is full of worry and pensiveness and overcogitation, actually digestion goes down, right? And I think most of us have had the experience of not having appetite or not feeling like you're digesting well if you've got a lot on your mind, right? So this is all the function of the E. And if, over time, this can lead to dullness, forgetfulness, and typically we have this experience if we've been studying for midterms or something, when the midterms are over and you feel a little bit stupid, right? This is your E that's just fatigued, right? And there may be changes in your appetite and your digestion along with that, which we can talk about as sort of student syndrome. Parenthetically, I want to note that some sources will call this the jur. They're still talking about it as the spirit of the spleen related to intention, focus, and intellect, but it's sometimes the jur and the E are interchanged. So you may encounter that down the road. In TCM, standard TCM, you don't encounter it, but outside of it in the tradition, you sometimes do. So just be aware of that right now, that sometimes people will be talking about the E, but they use the word jur instead. So that's our E, and we're going to return to that after I get through all 5 spirits. We're going to return to that with an exercise. So our next spirit is called the Po. The Po is sometimes called the Corporeal Spirit. And by corporeal, I want to be really clear. Corporeal, corpus means body, right? So the Po belongs to lung and metal. This is meant to be our most direct experience of existing in gravity, of having a physical body, right? So physical sensations, physical perceptions. Sometimes we see 7 Po. There's 3 Hun, which we'll get to, and 7 Po. And the 7 Po spirits are thought to be related to the holes in the head. So 2 eyes, 2 nostrils, 2 ears, 1 mouth. This means that the apertures that we use to perceive and relate to the external world are sort of under the governance of this corporeal spirit. When we think about what the Po's actual job is, it's sort of a unimaginative but very competent maintenance guy, right? The Po goes around and fixes things in your body. So if you get a paper cut, the Po is going to heal it, right? If you get sick, it's going to make you better. If you are growing, the Po is going to help you build out. It kind of has a very set playbook dictated by the ancestors, right? Sort of these patterns that have been with us for many, 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 many thousands of years, right? And it's going to just do those sort of by rote. It's thought of as a substantial corporeal spirit. It's not thought of as being very imaginative. There's not a lot of inspiration here. It's much more like somebody who gets a very specific job description done very well, right? do this stuff, take care of the body. Okay, I know how to do this, right? It's thought of as a yin spirit because it's more related to the heaviness of the body, the corporealness, the embodiedness, the manifestness of the body, right? So it's thought that at death, the pole spirit returns to the earth and dissolves into its constituent elements, right? When we look at the actual character of Po, we see that there's on the right side, there's a character for Gui, which means ghost or spirit. And on the left side, there's the white. And this white is related to the color of metal element, right? So sometimes called the white spirit. When we get into a little bit more esoterica, it's thought that when there is a haunting or a ghostly presence someplace, this is an unresolved Po spirit, right? There's something about the spirit which is not able to let go and return all the way to the earth and dissolve, right? So this can be unresolved karma or trauma. It can be like a task left undone. It can be something that the body thought it really, really needed, but didn't get before it died. It can be just some sort of disassociation at the time of death. It can leave unresolved Po spirits in sort of the esoteric traditions where exorcisms and things are part of the medicine, right? So we don't talk a lot about Po medicine, like how to resolve unresolved spirits, but traditionally in China, there was a lot of thought given to this, and a lot of sources of pathology were thought to be from the spirit world, from things that were unresolved from the ancestors or from locations, right? And these would be these Po spirits that were not able to let go completely and return to the earth and dissolve. So they're sort of stuck. It's a spiritual stagnation in a place, right? So we all have a Po spirit. We're glad that we have a Po spirit. They take care of daily tasks of body maintenance and everything like that. And they're related to the lung. So we think about these activities in our life that just happen without us thinking, like breathing, right? We breathe all the time. When we're done breathing, that means our Po spirit is giving up the ghost, so to speak, right? When we think about the next spirit, the Jur is also related to the physical manifestation of the body, insofar as it belongs to the water phase in the kidney. And we learn in foundations that the kidney is related to Jing, right? Which I defined as the tendency to appear manifest, the tendency to appear substantial is the Jing, right? And so the Jur has this very, very concrete relationship to this, insofar as without the Jur, nothing happens, right? The Jur is this spark at the center that says something's going to happen here. Something's going to appear manifest. There will be a body here, you know? So we think about the Jur as being the deep, deep, deep innate will to survive, right? So it is a willpower. And here's where I probably diverge a little bit from sort of standard TCM. You know, they'll talk about the Jur being the willpower, but this is really this really, really deep, non-rational will to survive, right? So if you're, you know, out in the ocean drowning, the Jur is what has you flailing towards the surface, right? Or if, you know, you're being attacked, the Jur is what, you know, makes you fight back really strongly. It's this fight or flight kind of stuff, you know, which we know is related to adrenal function, all this stuff sort of around the kidney in modern biology. But traditionally, this was thought of as being the job of the Jur, of the spirit of the kidney, to keep you living. The Jur is not rational. It's not analytical. The Jur is capable of incredible things. So the Jur would also be the thing that, you know, you hear these stories of you know, a mother pulling a car off of her child or something using these incredible feats of strength. You know, this is also the Jur, like, I will survive. And it's also the thing that, like, if somebody is, you know, God forbid, trying to kill you or suffocate you or something, is the thing that fights back, right? So it's a spirit of fight and survival and willpower. It declines over time, right? It declines over time. So age-related and illness-related decline that weaken the kidneys, weaken our deep reserves, also weaken the Jur. Ultimately, when we lose this will to survive, we move into an area that's called failure to thrive, which is sort of something we see in hospitals with terminally ill people or with premature babies, some things like that, where they don't have this strong Jur, this strong willingness to continue to fight and survive, right? But sometimes, I mean, we often see this all the way till the time when people die. So, you know, somebody who's got a degenerative disease, when they're actually at death's door, their body will still be fighting. They're fighting for that next breath. They're fighting. Their heart is still beating like crazy, even though it's pushing through whatever kind of disease they might have. And this is also the Jur, just pushing, 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 because that's what it knows how to do, right? So The jur is obviously very important. In the TCM information, they say the jur is also related to short-term memory, right? And I think this is mostly around the fact that jur decline is related to jing decline, which is related to kidney decline. And as people age, things like short-term memory, things like that also decline. But we can think about other things like sometimes if there's a strong traumatic event that sort of mixes up our jur a little bit, sometimes sometimes we will become less clear in our jur if that happens. So that can disrupt our focus, it can disrupt our willpower, it can disrupt our follow through, right? And we see this in PTSD patients sometimes. And just as a parenthetical note, this is sometimes called the E. It's confusing because we know that the E in our modern TCM is really all about the spleen, but you may see that sometimes this E that is the will to survive, we call the jur. Right? Now, a very fascinating spirit is the spirit of the Hun. And the Hun and the Po are almost always paired together. And in fact, if we look at the character, the Hun character and the Po character are the same character, except for the radical on the left-hand side. On the Po, it's the character for white. And on the Hun, it's the character for cloud. And that tells us a lot about what this is supposed to mean. So the Hun spirit belongs to the wood phase and the liver organ. And it's meant to be this insubstantial, sort of refined intelligence that resides in our experience, right? So we can think about this as being inspiration. We can think about it as being imagination. It's also appetite, right? Appetite. Without inspiration, we don't set goals and we don't plan well. So it's this idea of the future a little bit. It's something not directly in your present moment, but thinking about what might be, right? Thinking about what might be. So it's also sort of the realm of fantasy and stuff like that. There was 7 Po, which we related to the sense, the holes in the head rather, which include a lot of our sense organs, right? We say there's 3 Hun, and these 3 Hun are thought to be the insubstantial body. And really, don't hang up here because don't get hung up here because we'll see that it gets a little confusing because the three Hun are sometimes called the Jing Qi and the Shun, right? And what we mean by these 3 Hun is that we actually can't take apart a physical body and find any of these, right? If we chopped you up, I wouldn't be able to find the Jing, the Qi, or the Shun. I would just see, meat and bones and skin and hair, right? And none of these is actually Jing, Qi, or Shun. It's thought that the Hun imagination, this imaginative faculty, is one of the reasons that we're actually manifest at all. There's this insubstantial body around which the substantial body sort of aggregates. And this insubstantial bodies here is because there's sort of a universal curiosity, right? There's sort of a universal inspiration, a universal imagination. So in the Western mystic literature that we sometimes say that the universe is an idea in the mind of God. In the mind of God, there's an inspiration, there's an imagination which creates this realm of manifestation. And there's a little bit of that in this too, right? When we think about biologically in our own experience, the Hun is definitely related to dreaming, right? The Hun is related to dreaming. Every night it's said that the Hun comes out from the outside world and goes in through the aperture of the liver, which is the eyes, sinks into the heart space, and then goes to a place that we call I don't know, and then comes back with inspiration, right? So it visits the realm that's before and after death and comes back with these subconscious or semi-conscious impressions, ideas, inspirations, appetites, which if our Hun is in good shape, if our liver blood is in good shape, if our heart blood is in good shape, that this will actually be very helpful information for us. If we're really exhausted, if we're running very blood deficient, we don't necessarily come back from dreaming feeling refreshed. We come back from dreaming sometimes feeling like we're not rested. And this indicates that the Hun has not made it all the way back to I don't know and is not returning with inspiration because of this, right? So if our Hun is weak, we're not inspired, we can be very indecisive, we often can't plan, and sometimes we actually feel depressed, right? There's not this spark that's kind of animating our experience, right? Some folks suffer from an overactive Hun, right? And some folks suffer in a wave where you sometimes have a weak Hun, an overactive Hun, and this overactive Hun is sometimes mania. And if any of you have a history of dealing with manic behavior, either in yourselves or those around you, you know that often manic people are very, very, very inspired. They have all these ideas, they have all these plans, they have all these different connections between different things that they're making. Very, very inspired, right? Often too much, right? The Hun is overactive there, and all these plans aren't going to come because it's just out in the realm of the incorporeal. It's actually really tough to bring that sort of mania into a real game plan, right? which would probably take a little bit more E, right? A little bit more spleen focus, a little bit more earthiness, right? How do you bring this Hun incorporeal inspiration to the real world? Well, you probably need some E behind it. You probably need a little bit more focus, right? So the Hun is fascinating. If you get into sort of mental health from a TCM perspective, there's a lot of talk about the Hun, and actually Machiosha has done a lot of interesting work around this if you're curious. The fifth spirit that we'll get to, or the fifth intelligence, is called the Shun. And Shun we've talked about before in Jing Qi Shun. And we've talked about Shun in very broad terms as if Jing is this tendency to manifest and Qi is transformation, then Shun is sort of radiance with that candle model where Jing is the candle wax, Qi is the flame burning the wax, transforming it, and Shun is the luminosity, the radiance from that transformation of Jing, from that transformation of the tendency to manifest into consciousness, right? We can talk very clinically about the Shun. We say that the Shun shines from the eyes. So every time we meet someone, whether we want to or not, if we're a sighted person, we're doing an instant diagnosis with them by looking them in the eyes, right? And we see how lively are they? How connected are they? Is there something foggy there? Is there something disconnected about this person, right? We see it from their eyes instantly, and we do this automatically as human beings, right? Not just from the eyes, but also the pulse. So there's a saying, yo gun, yo wei, yo shun, which means that the pulse should have root, stomach, and spirit, right? So as we feel pulses, we're going to look for these things. Can we feel that the pulse is very rooted? Do we feel like it's actually, stomach means, is it digesting food well? Is there enough blood there? And shun is like, what does it feel like? Does it feel sluggish and tired? Does it feel lively? And this is the shun of the pulse, the spirit of the pulse, right? Voices also have spirits. So you don't need to be a sighted person. If you can hear whether somebody has a spirited voice, a spirited affect, right? Or if they're muted, you know? So when we talk about shun, we're talking about consciousness, but we're also talking about countenance. And countenance is not a word that we use very much, but the idea of countenance is, how does somebody appear to you as a whole, right? How does somebody appear to you as a whole? Do they feel like they have a lively presence or a dull presence, a calm presence or an agitated presence? And this is our readout of shun, right? This is our readout of shun, is sort of this countenance, like how does a person present in general to us, right? We say that the shun belongs to the heart and the fire element. And it certainly is true that in most traditional wisdom paths, they put the seat of consciousness in the chest, right? And this was actually a debate between Plato and Aristotle in Western civilization, is where is the consciousness actually? And I remember when I was in Taiwan studying Bagua with my teacher there, whose English was way better than my Chinese. He would say, oh, in my mind, I know. And he would touch his chest. And I was like, wow, that was the first time I had seen that. This is before I studied Chinese medicine. I was like, oh, in my mind, I know. But he was, oh, in my mind, I know. And he was putting the seat of his consciousness in his chest instead, right? So the shun, when we think in terms of the five spirits, the shun is, one of my instructors described it as, it's the noise of the party of the other four spirits. When the other four spirits come together and relate, the shun is sort of what happens. If you're standing outside the room and you're listening, this is what we're seeing. And so an imbalance in any of those other four spirits can manifest in the shun. And we know this, right? If your hun is feeling fatigued, we notice that in the shun, right? If your pol is not doing well and you're not feeling that well, or your body's sort of falling apart, we notice that as well. If your will to survive is flagging, we notice that also, right? So we see the manifestation of the other four spirits in the shun, in the consciousness, right? One of the markers of health in the shun is this ability to relate, the ability of those four spirits to relate harmoniously, but also the ability of us to relate to other people, right? So when we do our Qigong and we breathe at the level of the heart, we say that this is working on our shun, working on our consciousness, working on our ability to connect to the environment and the people around us and relate to them smoothly. On the other hand, we can't think too tightly about cause and effect. We're actually not that related in linear cause and effect through time in our traditional cosmology here. Shun is also the most immediate thing, right? The reason you can hear me, the reason you can perceive this screen that I'm on, the reason you can hear my voice, the reason you can feel anything, feel the space around you, feel your weight, feel whatever's going on in your body, is because of shun. So shun is the only thing in the universe we directly experience as real. Everything else is sort of mental theory, right? An interesting thing is I can attest to my own shun, but I can also attest to your shun. When we are together, we feel a sense of connection, and why it feels different to be with a person than with a rock, although a rock has a certain kind of shun. We're not going to connect to it as directly as we do a person, right? Because the shun is not as closely related to the shun that we actually experience, right? Philosophically, we say the shun is beyond yin and yang, right? There's something about shun when we talk about Tao and De, which we haven't talked a lot about, but Tao being this big picture of everything in the universe, and De being our experience of that, right? Our experience of that. Shun is right there. Shun is right there, right where Tao and De, the universe and your own experience, relate to each other. We say shun resides in the heart, and we could even say that the coming and going of the shun is an illusion, like shun is always there, sort of this universal presence, this universal consciousness of which we participate in one particular location of it, right? I have my location of shun over here in North Oakland on this Monday morning, and you all have your own perception of shun from wherever you're listening to this, and then we'll all have kind of shun together when we meet. But theoretically, the shun is not separate, right? So the shun that I'm experiencing, the shun that you're experiencing, actually the same shun, just shining out through different apertures. And each one is the entire shun of this entire Tao De complex of the universe. So this is when we talk about universal consciousness, right? That the division between different aspects of shun, this individual manifestations between you and me, between self and other, between yin and yang, up and down, all these things, is actually illusory. And there's actually just one giant Tao De shun complex, which is beyond yin and yang, right? But when we get into the medicine, it's very particular, and you all will encounter very specific uses of this term shun that are not this big sort of universalist picture, but particular instances of it. So we can say somebody has a cloudy shun, right? Or a disturbed shun. So a cloudy shun is when somebody looks really foggy, right? A disturbed shun is when somebody's very agitated, and we can have mixtures of these. And so a lot of mental illnesses from the sort of ICD-10 biopharmacological model of health and pathology are thought of as shun disturbances, right? Shun disturbances. If your shun is disturbed, then you may be exhibiting sort of mental illness in various kinds of contexts. And we can get very technical about that, and you will in your diagnosis classes when you break down especially heart and liver disorders. There's some in there that are very clearly about this. So these are our 5 spirits. I'm going to stop share here just for us. Actually, no, let's go to handout week 9, and I want to read a quote. So there is a handout that I'll be sharing with you guys. There's some acupoint vocabulary for your review about the stuff around the knee. So take a look at that. And I just wanted to touch here these quotes from the Yellow Emperor's Classic of Medicine. So very, very old text. This is the one translated by Mao Xingni, which he's taken some liberties, but I like the way that he's talked about this. So, and we'll sort of touch on how this relates to a Qigong exercise or a Neigong exercise that we'll do together on Thursday. So the Yellow Emperor said there are 5 requisites for an effective practitioner. Most physicians ignore these 5 edicts. First, one must have unity of mind and spirit with undistracted focus, right? And so what's the undistracted focus he's talking about here? Probably the E, right? Probably the E, the spirit of the spleen. Second, one must understand that practice the Tao of self-preservation and cultivation. Yang Sheng, this is what we're doing together, right? Third, one must be familiar with the true properties and actions of each herb. So yeah, study herbology, right? Fourth, one must be proficient in the art of acupuncture. Yeah, you got to be good at sticking needles in people. Fifth, one must know the art of diagnosis, right? One must know the art of diagnosis. So don't just go sticking needles in people randomly. You should know what you're doing, right? When one follows these 5 edicts, one will be effective. With acupuncture, one can tonify the deficient, sedate the excess, yin and yang. But if one can observe yin and yang laws of the universe and truly apply their essence to treatment, the results will be even better. This is like shadow following form. There is no secret here. It is that simple. So the main things I want folks to focus in on here is first, one must have unity of mind and spirit with undistracted focus. And we're going to do an exercise together that works on this. This is a muscle you can actually exercise. A later quote from the same section. The most important thing to make sure that the qi in the channels arrives. So this is called de qi. When you are doing acupuncture, you want to make sure there's contact, right? There's contact with the qi of the patient. You must grasp the moment, right? You have to be present, right? Regardless of how deep or shallow the point, or whether it is distant or proximal, when practicing acupuncture, you must focus your qi and your shun or spirit as if facing an abyss 1,000 feet deep. So think about that. Where is your mind if you're facing an abyss 1,000 feet deep? If you're going on some little ledge and you could fall all the way off, are you thinking about what you're going to do tomorrow? No. Are you wondering what your Twitter feed is saying? No, none of that stuff, right? You are right there, really paying attention. Everything must be done with delicate care. When manipulating the needles with your fingertips, you should handle the needles as if handling a fierce tiger. Focus all your attention, right? So here it is. Here's this direct application of this 5 spirit, 5 intelligences theory to the act of acupuncture. When we practice martial arts as a prelude, or along with Qigong and Neigong practice, Yangsheng practice, we spend a lot of time in this because this presence, this focus is so important. This cultivating of the Yi, the short-term focus of the mind. If anyone has ever been on a meditation retreat, almost every form of meditation starts with a focus exercise to focus the attention. Some people call this access attention, like a degree of attention where there's sufficient attention to do the other stuff. So that may be counting breaths, that may be focusing on a candle, that may be labeling thoughts, emotions, things like perceptions that come up in your experience, but you're staying with the present moment and actually focusing, sort of fine-tuning the mind, right? So when we meet together on Thursday, we're going to be doing an exercise together that actually is drawn from Xingyiquan, which is a sister art of TaiJi, that really works on this focus. And we'll be doing one particular exercise where we can work on the focus very strongly, so that when we move to the treatment room and we're with a patient, we can put everything aside. And when we're putting that needle in, really, really be present with what we're doing. And it gets easier over time, but really, really be present with, okay, here's my intention. I am present to my own shun, and I'm present in my fingertips as I put this needle in, and there's a connection between all of them. Okay, so I will share this handout with y'all, and I may have some additional readings. I'll see what comes up, and then we will all meet together on Thursday and do an exercise together. All right, everybody have a great few days.